Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'm going to be discussing the Prime Minister's questions from yesterday, where Keir Starmer of Labour attacked Boris Johnson's miserliness with the nurses' pay award, and the SNP, Kirsten Oswald, this time not Ian Blackford, was asking about the Erasmus scheme for students. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news in politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So the issue with the nurses, now this is interesting. I want to sort of segue into this with a comment I had on the channel as well. Now, Keir Starmer used all of his questions to ask about the nurses' pay award. For those who don't know what's going on, the government have announced in their budget last week that nurses should get a pay rise of 1%. This is below the level of inflation and therefore represents a real terms pay cut. It is also the case that for all Boris Johnson's boasting about recent nursing pay awards, if you compare the nurses' pay now with when Labour were last in power, it is a real terms pay cut. In other words, it has gone up by less than the combined rate of inflation since Labour were last in power. And when I talked about the nurses' pay award beforehand, I picked at the fact that Boris Johnson said that nurses had received, what was it, something like a 12.5% pay rise in the last 3 years, which wasn't true. What he actually meant was that the starting salary of nurses, who, remember, starting nurses do not represent the bulk of the NHS in terms of the nurses, but the starting salary for nurses has gone up by around about 12.5%. But I noticed in PMQs yesterday, Boris Johnson kept referring to starting salary, which is interesting because, again, it highlights the fact that as much as Boris Johnson lies all the time, he tries to avoid getting caught out in too many lies in Parliament, where it's a bit more serious. And he told another lie in Parliament, which I'm going to come to as well, related to this. And the thing is, and if you look at the different salary levels within what's called the Band 5 NHS nurses, so the starting salary has gone up by a little bit. It's gone up above the level of inflation over the last 3 years, although I don't know that it's gone up above the level of inflation compared to when Labour were last in power. But certainly the average salary of nurses has not. And you think to yourself, so why is that? And it's really simple. We've got a shortage of tens of thousands of nurses. Boris Johnson talked about the fact in PMQs that we've got more nurses than when he became Prime Minister. That is true. We still have a shortage of tens of thousands. He talked about the more nurses in training. There are always nurses in training because there are always nurses retiring. But again, is he going to close that gap of, 40,000 nurses short in the next few years? No. He says he's going to recruit 50,000 new nurses. But when he last made that, or he first made that claim, I should say, he also accepted that quite a lot of those 50,000 nurses would be nurses that are already nurses. So it wouldn't actually be new nurses. That's how they play with figures. So the reason is they have a shortage of nurses, so that's why they increase the salary of starting nurses by above the level of inflation, because they need to make it more attractive. One of the reasons why we're so short of nurses is because they're paid very poorly. I'm a teacher, right? Do you know what? It was one of the biggest shocks of my life when I discovered that teachers get paid more than nurses. I'm pretty sure that hasn't even always been the case, but that's shocking. Now, I'm not a nurse. My mum was a nurse, but I do not believe that the skill and training for a teacher is greater than that of a nurse. And you cannot say that teachers are more important than nurses. We need both. So, and teachers get paid, just a classroom teacher gets paid a lot more than just a ward nurse. It's a lot more. And I do not know why that should be. But that is the extent to which nurses are devalued. The Conservatives are basically applying their free market policies, aren't they? We haven't got enough nurses, so we need to bung up the wages of the nurses at the starting end. But we won't increase the nurses at the height. Once they've qualified and they're in the service, we won't increase their wages above the level of inflation. We'll give them effective pay cuts, real terms pay cuts. That's what's going on here. So you know, Starmer pushed this on and every single one. And when you come out of it, Boris Johnson, of course, came up very badly. And here's where the lie was. He tried to say, because Starmer was pointing at the fact that the government have already budgeted for a 2.1% increase. In fact, Boris Johnson promised that nurses would get, at this point, they would get at least a 2.1% increase. He was trying to suggest it might be more. It was going to be at least 2.1%. Boris Johnson voted for it. He got his Conservatives to vote for it. And now they're going against it. It's less than half of that pay award. Boris Johnson, in response, tried to say that Labour, specifically Starmer, voted against that when it came up in Parliament. That is not true. That's an outright lie. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Later on, Boris Johnson's press secretary, shouldn't even exist as a post, was being asked this about, you know, by various journalists saying, that's not true, isn't it? The Prime Minister lied to Parliament again, blah, blah, blah. And his press secretary refused to say that there was an issue here. They didn't say that Boris Johnson didn't lie. They didn't say that he was correct. They referred to what the Speaker did later. So what happened is, towards the end of PMQs, or really at the end of PMQs, various Labour MPs said to the Speaker, the Prime Minister twice misled Parliament there. He was wrong to say that we voted against this. The Speaker accepted it and made a statement to that effect. But here's the thing. Boris Johnson should correct the record. But what the press secretary said is it's all been sorted out by what the Speaker said. So they're admitting that Boris Johnson misled Parliament, deliberately or inadvertently, it doesn't matter. They're accepting it, but they just refuse to say the words. Because they know that Boris Johnson is under a lot of fire at the moment for his dishonesty, his general dishonesty, particularly his dishonesty in Parliament, breaching the ministerial code. But in terms of the comment I had, going back to the nurses issue, well, it's still the same issue. Someone said to me when I was doing my video yesterday on the sort of things that could cause Boris Johnson some real problems in terms of personal popularity, they suggested I missed one out. Oh, this NHS nurses pay deal could really bring him down. No, it won't. Doesn't look good for him. And that PMQ's absolute shocker from Boris Johnson, absolutely. And it will hit the Conservatives' popularity and it will hit his popularity. Will it sink him? Absolutely not. And I'll tell you why. We saw last year, didn't we? How many times did Boris Johnson forge ahead with a deeply unpopular policy? How many times did he forge ahead with a policy that even Conservative MPs were hesitant about? As is happening now, there are Conservative MPs that Starmer was able to quote who were dead against this policy. How many times did he forge ahead and then U-turn? So many times it's untrue. And yet, has he suffered any long-term harm from those U-turns? No, he hasn't. Let me put it this way. If it ever gets to the point where Boris Johnson forging ahead with this is going to do serious damage to his reputation or the party's reputation, they'll just reverse it. They'll U-turn again. Oh, we'll give the 2.1% pay rise, they'll say. In fact, it may be their plan all along. That actually may be their plan, because think about it this way. If Boris Johnson goes ahead with it and then U-turns, he gets to look generous. Oh, we've found the money. We've given them double what we were going to give them. Everyone breathes a sigh of relief and think it's all sorted. Now you can say, well, but he's suffered damage because now it looks like yet again he's adopted a Labour policy. Keir Starmer called for this. Boris Johnson's followed suit. Yet again he's following suit. Yeah, sure, some damage has been caused. But then consider the alternative. Let us consider that the Conservatives had given that 2.1% pay award last week, in the budget. Would people be going, oh, great, Boris Johnson's, kept his promise for 2.1%? No, I'll tell you why. There'd be two things that we could be critical of. One, he promised at least 2.1%. Now, people would think reasonably, hang on a minute, after the year that the NHS has had, you're only going to give them the bare minimum that you promised. You suggested it could be more, Prime Minister. Why, after the year of heroism, is it not more? So they'd be criticised for it. The second thing to note is that although it would be an above inflation pay rise, it would only be just above, and it would still be a real terms pay cut over the last Labour government. So they'd award the 2.1% and they'd be criticised. This way, they award the 1% and are criticised. Then later on, U-turn, award the 2.1%. A lot of the criticism melts away. Because now if we try saying, yeah, but he promised at least 2.1%, and after the year it should be more than that, and and it's still a real terms pay cut compared to 2010, if we try and say that, they'll say, but fair play. I mean, he doubled it. He doubled what he was going to pay them. They can win out of this. And they know they wouldn't suffer long-term damage from the U-turn because they've had so many U-turns last year. What is one more? What is one more? So this actually could be planned. I'm not saying it definitely is planned. It may well be that they are trying to go through with the 1% and they just know that they've got it in their back pocket. If it gets too hot, politically hot for them, they can just revert to the 2.1% and be fine, be ultimately fine. Then next year they'll get to say that they made an above inflationary pay award, despite the fact that it was only after sustained political pressure, but that's not what they'll say. So there is the issue there. It's a bit like last week. This was a topic that Boris Johnson desperately didn't want to talk about. You could tell that by the fact that he lied, suggesting that Starmer and Labour had voted against the pay award, which is one of those, and again, it's one of those things you could think, well, was it inadvertent or was it deliberate? I mean, here's what I would say. Let's be realistic. Different Labour leaderships will have different policies and so on. Of course, he's referring to before anyway. But the bottom line is no Labour leadership ever and no Labour MP ever would vote against a pay award for a public sector worker, especially a nurse. So it's not even an innocent mistake you can make. Oh, I thought they voted against it. You could genuinely think that for various things, but you couldn't possibly think it for that. A Labour government would never, in fact, a Labour Party would never vote against it. Generally what happens is Labour vote for their own motions on this. When they're in government, they put forward pay awards that are recommended. You have an independent body that recommends what pay awards should be. And then a Labour government pays it, a Conservative government pays half of it. And then when the Conservatives are in power, Labour parties, Labour oppositions in this case, will tend to put forward their own motions for pay increases and they will vote for those. So yeah, it was a lie. It was called out by a lie effectively by the Speaker and by Parliament. It was sorted. It was the record hasn't been corrected by the Prime Minister himself, and his own press secretary refused to acknowledge that he got it wrong, even though they couldn't say that he hadn't got it wrong because it had been called out in Parliament and verified by the Speaker that it was wrong. So then we come on to the SNPs. Now this is also very important, the Erasmus scheme, which is a way of really enriching the lives of students, young people, which the government wanted to scotch completely. And that's no pun intended, by the way, because it was the SNP that asked it. It's Kirsten Oswald. There were apparently technical problems with Ian Blackford. Presumably he would have been doing it, well, he would have been doing it from home. So issues with the Wi-Fi or something. So the SNP's deputy leader in Westminster, Kirsten Oswald, took up the reins. And she was comparing with, so Boris Johnson's put in place of, he promised Erasmus would not be cancelled. It's been cancelled. He's put in place something he calls the Turing scheme, which is supposed to do much the same thing, give students an experience of a year out abroad in a university in another country. When he was tackled about this, Kirsten Oswald talking about the opportunities being denied to young people, which is absolutely what it is. Boris Johnson tried to suggest that the Erasmus scheme actually just favoured wealthy students and his scheme would actually be suitable for everyone. The egregiousness of this lie is that it is the exact opposite. Social media, when Erasmus was being cancelled, was full of people who came from very humble backgrounds, working class parents, sometimes parents where not everyone was working, low household incomes, that were able to use the Erasmus scheme to study abroad. The Turing scheme, ironically, is only going to be suitable for wealthy people because it's not properly funded. So you have to stump up quite a bit yourself. And that is what is so egregious about this. The Prime Minister is trying to claim that Turing is better for social mobility and it is far, far worse. That is the bottom line. So right to raise that as well. But again, it's one of those things where the Prime Minister just lies about a situation and there'll be no consequences at all. But yeah, there we go. Those are my thoughts on PMQs from yesterday. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.